Welcome to another episode of Lawyers for Immigrants with your host, Yifei He, president of the law office of Yifei He, where they are dedicated to helping immigrants and new Americans. In every episode, Yifei interviews attorneys across different practice areas and asks them how they are helping immigrants. You can find this show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and at www.yifeihelaw.com. Now here's the host of Lawyers for Immigrants, Yifei He.
Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Lawyers for Immigrants. My name is Yifei He, and I'm the president of the law office of Yifei He, where we're dedicated to helping immigrants and new Americans. On every episode, we interview lawyers who are not immigration lawyers and ask them how they are helping immigrants. And today, my guest is Seth Zuckerman with Chaudry Law PLLC. Seth is a federal and state criminal defense lawyer, and he's served in roles such as former prosecutor and now private attorney. So Seth, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Yifei. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So how did you get into criminal defense law?
So, as you mentioned, when I first graduated from law school, my first job out of law school was working as a prosecutor, an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn. I had that job for about 5 years. And during my time at the DA's office, I was responsible for prosecuting a whole slew of criminal matters. You start at a low level prosecuting misdemeanor cases, and you work your way up to trying felony cases. While I was at the DA's office, I tried a whole slew of cases ranging from DWI to domestic violence to assault, shootings, assaults, robbery, homicide cases. I was involved in long-term investigations into fraud cases. I tried 15 jury trials while I was an assistant district attorney, presented hundreds of cases to grand juries, and really got the feel for how the criminal justice system works from being a prosecutor.
Well, great. That's a lot of trial experience. And currently, you're a partner at Chaudry Law, which is dedicated to criminal defense. Is that right?
Correct. We're a criminal defense trial boutique located in Midtown Manhattan, and we represent individuals and companies who find themselves in the crosshairs of any legal investigation, and that's by any federal law enforcement authority, a state law enforcement authority, anyone who's been arrested and charged with a crime. Those are our clients.
I see. And so by boutique, you mean you guys handle very high level and high profile cases, right?
Right. Boutique, we're a small firm. We've got 5 attorneys, but we really focus on high level criminal defense matters. And again, that's both in state court in New York and New Jersey, and in federal courts, both in New York and throughout the country.
I see. And can you tell me a little bit about the difference between state and federal criminal defense?
Sure. So state criminal defense is when you're charged in New York by the people of the state of New York. So that means that a prosecutor in whatever county you're charged in has brought that case against you. And we do get involved in investigations prior to arrest. So sometimes they're doing an investigation and they're issuing subpoenas, and we get involved in those cases as well. But a state case is brought in the county in which you're charged, is brought on behalf of the people of the state of New York, and it's applying New York State law to alleged incidences and crimes. Whereas federal cases, there are district courts in every state throughout the country, and there are assistant United States attorneys who work for the Department of Justice, who are there to enforce federal crimes and federal laws that have been allegedly broken. And we get involved in that stage as well, sometimes in the investigation stage during the grand jury investigation and the subpoena phase before someone's been arrested. And we also represent those who have then been arrested and indicted and are facing federal charges in a district court somewhere in the United States.
Okay. And what kind of cases are federal in nature?
So a lot of white collar cases are federal in nature. And when I say white collar, that means a financial crime. So whether that's an insider trading case, a fraud case, a wire fraud, mail fraud, healthcare fraud, those seem to be a lot of federal cases as opposed to state cases. But there are obviously federal cases that are narcotics trafficking, that you can get a federal case for a homicide if it's part of a conspiracy. There are federal Hobbs Act robbery cases. There are violent cases that the feds do take from state courts where there could be jurisdiction in both parts. But on the federal side, we predominantly handle white collar cases.
Right. So is it true that federal cases are more serious and involve higher stakes than state
Correct.
cases?
The amount of time that you could potentially do on a federal case is a lot more serious. The level of litigation required is a lot higher in federal court, and they're usually more serious cases. That's not to be said, though, that there can't be a very serious case in state court, but overall, on average, the cases in federal court are generally more serious.
Okay, that's because they face higher prison time, and there's also more complicated facts involved for federal cases. Is that right?
That's mostly right. Obviously, if you're charged with a murder in state court, you're facing a lot of prison time. But across the board, generally, you face more time on federal cases than you do on state cases.
Okay, so how do you get into federal court? Does it depend on who you are? Like, for example, if you're an immigrant, you're not a U.S. citizen, you can get into federal civil court. So if you were charged with a crime and you're not a citizen, you're an immigrant, are you in federal court?
Not necessarily. The prosecutor's office who decides to bring the case isn't considering the person's immigration status when they bring the case. So you can be charged in state court, you could be charged in federal court. The prosecutors generally aren't looking as to whether or not the person is an immigrant, whether or not they're here on a green card, whether or not they're applying for citizenship. That's usually not taken into consideration as to which office and whether you're going to be charged with a state crime or a federal crime. So it's not the option of the person who's being charged or even the person who's a victim of a crime. It's not their option either. It's the choice of the prosecutors as to whether or not the case is going to be brought in state or federal court.
Okay, and you've mentioned a few examples of some federal cases, such as white-collar fraud or drugs. So are these, what's the definition of a federal crime versus a state crime so that people can know?
Well, there's a New York State penal law, which is when you're charged with a crime, you're charged with violating a section of the New York State penal law. There's also a United States Code. And there are obviously many charges under there that you can be charged with. Both of them are very expensive and have hundreds, if not thousands, of sections. So anything that's considered a violation of the federal law can be brought in federal court.
Okay, I see. And can you describe the interplay between federal criminal law or state criminal law and immigration law? Sure.
So immigration law comes into play generally when the person who's charged is not a United States citizen. So if you get convicted and you're a non-citizen, you can face deportation, you can face the loss of your visa or green card, you could face a denial of citizenship if you're in the process of applying for citizenship. So there are many collateral consequences. In fact, when you take a plea, or if you're sentenced, the judges usually inform you that if you are not a United States citizen, there are consequences on the immigration side for being convicted of a crime. So I generally consult with immigration attorneys when I have a client who is not a United States citizen, because we need to consider what possible collateral consequences of not being a citizen can impact. For example, I have a client who was already facing a deportation order when he was arrested on my case. And then he was picked up by the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And as he's now fighting the criminal case, he's in what we call ICE custody, facing a deportation proceeding.
Okay. And how do you handle situations where you're representing immigrants?
Well, I consult very closely with immigration counsel. I'm not an immigration attorney. And I advocate on their behalf with the close consultation of an immigration attorney such as yourself, who can guide me and advise as to what the consequences are if we go this way or that way. And they're usually very strategically involved in the decisions that we make. And it depends on, obviously, the status of the person. as if they're here on a green card, if they're here as a permanent resident, if they're here illegally. It depends on the status of the person, and that affects what we're going to do. There are certain dispositions that are not favorable for someone who's not a United States citizen. I try and avoid those types of dispositions on cases because I know there's going to be immigration consequences if they are convicted of certain crimes.
I see. And then you also mentioned that one of your clients is in ICE lockup. So in addition to potentially being incarcerated during the criminal investigation or criminal prosecution, he's simultaneously incarcerated in immigration jail. So how are you dealing with that, representing someone in that situation?
Well, so I can't talk the specifics of that case, but what I could say is that that happens if there's a prior deportation order at the time that the person is arrested. So let's say, for example, someone had a deportation order from a prior proceeding and then either came back into the country illegally or never left and wasn't actually deported. That is a complicated scenario that I'm very well equipped to handle. We work with an immigration counsel on their options for appealing the deportation order and what their next steps can be and what pleas they could take that won't adversely impact the deportation order in order to try and appeal the deportation order to try and get that rescinded once the criminal case is resolved.
I see. But I'm sure client contact with someone who's incarcerated is very difficult, especially in federal prison.
Absolutely. And I didn't mean to cut you off, Yifei. Yeah, I mean, look, we deal with clients that are incarcerated all the time, whether they're in state custody in New York and Rikers Island, whether they're in federal custody at the MDC, or they've been sentenced somewhere else. We deal with clients that are incarcerated all the time. It makes communicating a lot more difficult, but we communicate with our clients regularly, whether it's by video calls at the prison that they're in, whether it's setting up phone calls through the legal hotlines that they have, or accepting client calls all the time. We are constantly getting calls from our clients who are incarcerated.
Okay, so in that situation, you mentioned when he's in ICE detention, are you still allowed to talk to him, even though you're not representing him in the immigration matter, but you're representing him in a criminal matter, which is a separate matter? Are you still allowed to be his attorney?
Yeah, absolutely. You're able to set up regular calls with anyone who's in ICE custody, depending on where they are and depending on the capacity of the jail, whether they have video calls or just phone calls. But as their attorney, you are given the same rights that any other attorney is given for the amount of calls that you can have and those privileges.
I see. But in general, it's a little bit more difficult when you're representing immigrants versus representing citizens, right? Because in addition to the charges, you also have to consider collateral consequences.
Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. When you're representing immigrants, you have to consider all of those facts as to what's going to happen with their citizenship status, whether they're going to be incarcerated at the end of the case, when they're going to be away from their family. We've had clients who live overseas and are only here on the criminal case and don't even have an immigration status here. And so that makes it more complicated. And so, yeah, that makes our cases much more complex, and it requires a lot more litigation. And we're fully equipped to handle that with the consultation of specific immigration attorneys who are well-versed in this field.
Okay, so by more litigation, what do you mean? Do you mean that they would want to go to trial versus just taking an offer if it would save them?
Potentially. There's a lot less pleas that are on the table for them if it's going to lead to their potential deportation or loss of a visa or green card or a possible denial of citizenship. I will also note that we've handled a bunch of what we call 440 motions, which are motions in New York State Court to vacate convictions for people who are applying for citizenship, who have a conviction dating back 10, 20, 30 years, that now they're applying for citizenship and it's gotten in the way, and we've been able to successfully vacate convictions for them so that there's no barriers to them applying for citizenship. So we've handled that as well.
Okay, and so for a 440 motion, what are the criteria to vacate a conviction if you were trying to get your citizenship?
Well, it's not directly as a result of getting your citizenship, but there are a list of factors under CPL 440 that allow for a possible motion to vacate the judgment. So every case requires a specific analysis as to what applies to that case. And then if there's a potential 440 motion, we can make that in order to vacate the prior judgment to allow that person to now apply for citizenship. So it's not just because they're applying for citizenship. There has to be some type of material defect in the judgment, but we're able to make that analysis after we review the case file and find if there's a defect and make the applicable motion and have a hearing if required.
I see. So from what I understand in the federal criminal context is that the judge is the Supreme Arbiter. The judge is the one who controls basically the proceedings. Is that right?
That is correct. In a federal criminal case, it's completely up to the judge as to what the sentence is going to be. The prosecutor has very little say, and in fact, no say. The prosecutor gets to make a recommendation, but the prosecutor does not get to have any decision-making authority. Whereas in state court in New York, if you come to a plea agreement, only in the most extreme circumstances will a judge reject a plea agreement between a defense attorney and a prosecutor. They generally agree to whatever's been agreed upon between the parties, the defendant and the prosecutor. In federal court, it doesn't play out like that. In federal court, it's completely up to the judge. So even if you make a plea, even if you take a plea and you have a plea agreement, that is non-binding on the judge. So in a plea agreement in federal court, there's only what we call a stipulated guideline range, which is a range that you parties have agreed would be the guideline sentence under the federal sentencing guidelines. The judge can go under those guidelines, can go in the guidelines, can go over the guidelines, and is non-bound by that. And the same thing, obviously, if it's a trial, it's completely up to the judge. This makes sentencing advocacy in federal court extremely important and a big part of our practice. So it's not over just after the trial. It's not over just when you take a plea. Our sentencing is a big, there's still a lot of advocacy to be done to show the judge who you are, why the sentence should be in a place where you want it to be, why they should, from our perspective as a defense attorney, usually deviate and go below the guideline range. So it's very different than in state court when you have an agreed upon plea and the sentencing is just what you've agreed upon. It's in federal court, it's a very hotly contested litigation most of the time.
I see. So basically in federal court, even if you agree to something with the prosecutor, for example, even if you agree to avoid immigration consequences of a plea, the judge can totally ignore it and then at sentencing, sentence you to a harsher consequence and just take away the ability to avoid deportation. Could that be true?
Correct. Now, we're talking simply just about sentencing, right? So the judge has the ability to differ in terms of sentencing. Obviously, you asked the question about immigration consequences in the agreement. Obviously, every case is case specific. So I'm not sure what other criteria you're thinking about. Obviously, there are some immigration friendly sentences. For example, getting less than 180 days is generally a favorable factor. So yes, that could have impacted. But if you're talking about a case where the guidelines are multiple years, I'm not sure that a plea agreement versus the judge's sentencing is going to have any collateral immigration consequences. But it can.
Right. So doesn't that make representing immigrants a lot harder in federal court? Because say you wanted to avoid the collateral consequences, and you can do so in state court, but in federal court, and say you're within the guidelines, the judge can just totally ignore that and then sentence you to more, just so that you can get deportation consequences as an immigrant.
That is correct. Although I will say, I'm not sure the judges are doing it specifically because they want you to face deportation consequences. In my experience, most judges do not want people to face deportation consequences. Obviously, it depends on the case, but the judge is usually sentencing the defendant to what they think is the appropriate sentence. And if they're going higher, they think that's the appropriate sentence based on the case, not because they're trying to get the person deported. In fact, I say generally, if they know the person is going to be deported, in my experience, judges are usually a little bit more lenient and give a better sentence if there's going to be deportation consequences. Not always, but that's what I've seen in my experience.
I see. And you mentioned sentencing is a big part of your practice. So in the context of representing an immigrant who's been convicted, who's taken a plea, how do you lead at sentencing with the factors? What do you consider when you're representing someone at sentencing who's an immigrant?
So we consider their background. We consider who they are as a person. We consider the crime that they've admitted to and they're convicted of now that they've taken a plea. We talk about the sentencing guidelines and other people that are similarly situated and what sentences they've gotten on similar cases. We do a pretty detailed analysis. We get sentencing letters from their close family, friends, employers, people who know them best, who could write to the judge to educate the judge about who this person is. Hopefully they don't have a prior criminal history, and we could talk about how this was a mistake in their lives and it's something that they regret and they've taken responsibility for and taken ownership for it by taking a plea, and hopefully will be in a better place once they are sentenced. And we conduct a detailed analysis of where we should go. Every sentencing is different, but we evaluate each case and we come up with what arguments we want to put forth to the sentencing judge that we think are the most important at the time of sentence for the judge to consider. And that includes the immigration status, right? If there is an immigration status issue, we make that a big section on our brief for sentencing about the person's status, about the consequences of the sentence, the potential consequences of the sentence, and the consequences that just the conviction may have on this person. Sometimes ICE is already involved. Sometimes ICE doesn't get involved until post-sentencing. It really depends. But generally, we know, based on the person's status, where this is going from an immigration perspective.
I see. I mean, as an immigration lawyer, I've had multiple clients come to me after they've been convicted and they've been sentenced in federal court. And unfortunately, they're not able to get citizenship, or they're going to be forced to leave the country, even though they've had a long history here. So I encourage my listeners, if you're facing criminal charges, to take the proactive stance and consult with a knowledgeable and experienced criminal defense lawyer such as Seth, because it makes a huge difference. Because some things are irreversible, and a lot of times, my clients come to me with irreversible issues. So it's very unfortunate. But in any event, I think that we're almost to our time. So I wanted to conclude by asking you if there's any additional resources that you'd like to share with our listeners.
Sure. So I want to echo what Yifei said, which is it's extremely important to consult with a criminal defense lawyer as soon as you know that you are being investigated or maybe facing criminal charges. The earlier you have a criminal defense attorney on board advocating for your interests, the better situation you may end up in. Obviously, if you have immigration issues with regards to being charged with a crime or being investigated, it's important to also consult with an immigration attorney. But the earlier you do that, the better, so that we could face these issues head on together. And feel free to contact me or visit my website, which is www.ChaudhryLaw.com, or you can call me at 212-785-5558.
Thank you. So appreciate you appearing on this show.
I appreciate you having me.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Lawyers for Immigrants with your host, Yifei He. You can find prior episodes on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and at www.yifeihelaw.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, and sharing this show with others.